Hello, welcome to round 8 of the Crazyhouse World Championship 2020. I have a match between Mugwort, myself, the commentator, and ArtOfDeception. It's one of those magical videos again where you're not going to see my lips moving, but you can still hear my voice anyway. So it's recorded a day and a half after the match. So 10 games of 3+2 Crazyhouse you're about to see. And I have white in the first game. So I was actually expecting a French in the first game because Art is well known for his deep preparation in the French, and I thought I really have one of two choices going into the match. I can try and enter his battlefield and find some new ideas, which maybe 10 or 15 moves into a line, or I can just play an exchange French, or even just do something random, knight f3 or b3 in the opening, and just play a game. But anyway, this is more a position that I'm familiar with in game 1, e4, knight f6, with an early exchange on d5 and queen e2 check. Bishop at e7 I think has only been played a couple of times, but I had noticed that he had played this before and was intending knight at h5. And I think we're pretty much both out of book here. I'm assuming he'll defend the bishop with the queen, and then I simply want to bring the knight to e5 and harass the queen, and he should find a way to stop it. But apart from that, we are both on our own. So normally in Bughouse here, you could ask for a bishop for a4 or b5 to pin the knight on c6. My first thought was exchanging the bishop on e6, knight takes e6. And a second thought is to hit the knight straight away with pawn at b5, knight b4, and then I could play safe with a move like d4 or d3 and defend with the queen on c2. Or I could try to play more risky, more aggressively, and go knight e5 and allow knight takes c2. But perhaps that's just a little bit too risky. If king f1, there'll be a possibly an eventual pawn on h3 to watch out for. But they're my two main options. I don't want to allow a move like pawn at g4 or pawn at e4, kicking the knight away from f3, and then the knight's jumping into d4, and I certainly don't want the white pawn on d4 at the moment. So I decided to go for my first thought, which was knight takes e6, after a long think, and bishop back at a4. So obvious intention is to trade and stick a knight on e5 and use the pawn on either d7 or f7. So the critical square at the moment seems to be e5 if he wants to defend, and if he wants to counterattack, then it's looking like knight at f4 would be the only decent way, because otherwise if he attacks the knight on f3 it's going to jump to e5 eventually anyway. So yeah, my mouse is hovering over the f4 square, expecting knight at f4, and then working out if I should defend with queen f1, or, well, another obvious move, bishop takes c6 and just leave the queen on e2. There's no real danger to my king, and knight takes g2 check is not a worry after king d1. So yeah, bishop takes c6 I'm leaning towards, but also I could throw in a pawn at f7 check. Actually, I think it's better to delay this pawn and keep it off the board for the moment. It wasn't necessary to play it straight away. He's never going to take it. He's always going to answer king d8. And potentially it could have been more useful on d7. So I think that was a slight mistake, playing the pawn on f7 straight away. Anyway, I'm not too unhappy. The knight's coming into e5 next move. And it's only a choice between knight to e5 or a new knight at e5. But keeping the knight off board might be very useful to hunt down the queen if she goes to d6 or b6, for example. So always useful to get another perspective, and after the match I had noticed that Zhang Li was streaming. I actually had my phone off during the match, and he sent me a couple of messages after the match saying, well, I won't say what he said just yet in case you haven't seen it. But yeah, always good to get another perspective. And he was saying possibly I could try hunting down the queen with knight to a4, because many of the squares the queen can go to, like b4, a5, can be answered by a knight at c6 check. But I wasn't sure what happens after queen d6. So I thought it was quite okay to hit the knight on f4, save the queen. I was a bit surprised by this immediate response. Knight takes g2, sacking the knight. Bishop at d4. I mainly need to worry about the knight on e5. I don't think f2 is such a big danger. I can always sidestep over to d1. And c3 is also not a worry. He doesn't want to take c3 and allow d takes c3, opening the bishop. But decided this is the moment to be aggressive, because I noticed after knight sack on d5 I have a queen takes to follow up, and if he puts something on d6 there could potentially be a knight at e6, which is looking rather nasty. So he doesn't take, but now because I have two knights in hand, d6 is really not a safe square for the queen, because I have a trick with using the vacancy on b7 for a knight. And the only other choice, or reasonable choice, is king c8, but no, I'm just going to answer that with pawn at d7 and take the queen straight away. There doesn't seem to be a counterattack on my king, and it's looking pretty comfortable. 29 seconds left. Should easily be enough time to convert this. It's been a pretty smooth start to the match in game one. And looking just to clean up by taking one of the bishops on e7 or f8. It doesn't really matter too much. Could possibly trade a bishop on e7 and stick it on a6, or perhaps queen at e8 check first, and then knight takes e7 and bishop at a6. Moving the knight from d5 is useful to open the queen on g2, because could be some queen takes c6 to follow up. So I decided to do a non-checking sequence with knight takes f8. It's usually harder for the opponent when they're short on time to calculate. Just changed my mind with bishop at d7, sack it on c6, because that again helps to open the queen on g2. So I didn't think queen takes d5 was necessary, or it may lead to mate, but it's certainly it's not worth the risk if I can't calculate mate. And the other thing is, it doesn't have to be a checking sequence, because he doesn't have any heavy pieces in response, and even if he did, I think he's a bit short. Or maybe rook at d1 would be painful. Alright, so just taking the bishop on b6, bishop at b7, and then the two knights are going to finish knight at b5 and knight d7. Or queen takes c7, of course. Alright, game two. And the other opening Art is well known for is playing the Scotch against e4, e5. So, did sort of have something else in mind, but decided to test him out, firstly with one of the main lines in the Scotch, which is an early bishop c5. So in chess I'm not sure whether knight f5 is very good. I think the most aggressive way to respond to that is playing d5 on move 5, but I had this against king switcher where I didn't respond very well. I might have done pawn at e6, or I can't even remember now what I did. But yeah, bishop d4 is a critical move. So we're actually following a game between Art and the finisher all the way up to here. Queen takes a2, knight takes g7 check, king d8. So white has sacrificed the whole rook and a pawn, but he has this g7 square for a pawn, and also the bishop on c3 is very soon going to be hitting the rook on h8. Now in that game Art played pawn at d6, and the best move from there is to ignore the pawn and go knight at b1. So to try and hit the queen straight away, because if he takes on c7 and ends up giving up the queen, then there's not enough attack for white. he can try and preserve the queen with queen f4 check, but then I think there is enough for black to hold. But this move I have not seen, knight f5, and it's a big choice. It's a very difficult position to understand because although the kings are safe in the short term, white's king probably a little safer than black's, the main idea is to stick a pawn back on g7, promote, and take the knight on g8, and just completely take over the back rank before black has a chance to put on the 5 pieces that he has at his disposal, and to open up with moves like d6 and bishop takes f5 and so on. Also d6, a bit of a worry, as knight takes d6 in response. So I'm thinking, well, knight at b1 may be too slow, because even if I get to take the queen on d2, he's already got a new queen on h8, and there's no compulsion for him to take back the knight on d2 and waste a move. He can just leave the knight there because it's not doing very much. I could try perhaps to defend the square h8 with a move like knight at g6. Again, it's not really in the spirit of the position, I don't think. I'd rather not be defending, because if I miss one move, then I'm probably just dead instantly, as well as giving up all the material back. I even thought about a funny move, pawn at g7, allowing bishop takes g7, just to stop him putting a pawn there. But again, it's all a bit slow. So rook at b1, certainly the most aggressive move. The other moves would be to bring the queen back somewhere to hit the pawn on e4, maybe queen e6. And just threatening queen takes e4 check, going for a counter-attack through the front door rather than the side. So he's played bishop e2, castled, allowed the promotion. He's going to play rook takes c1. And it's really very subtle to know when to trade rooks and when to defend your back rank, and perhaps there's a counter-attack via pawn at h3, which is my main thought. I have to do something quickly, otherwise he's just going to ignore whatever I do and go pawn at g7 and take the rook and just crush me on the back rank. So I wanted to at least make sure that I'm giving a check if he captures the rook on b1. And I've got to make him worry about something, because otherwise his king is just way too safe, and he's going to win all the material back, and I'm the one with the well, undeveloped position, and also a very unsafe king on d8 after pawn at g7. So white to play. I still think pawn at g7 is a reasonable choice. Maybe he could take the rook, bishop takes h8. He could even just go g takes h3 and say, what have you got? There's no knight at h4. The white knight on f5 is very well placed. It's a bit slow for me to challenge that knight. Again, d6 I don't think is the move I want to play, inviting a sacrifice. Well, it may be okay if his queen is on c1 to play d6 and bishop takes f5. d5, I'm not sure I want to invite him to open up the d file. So, any other ideas? Also, I was thinking if there's some way to block out the c3 h8 diagonal by putting something on d4, but just didn't quite see how it was really making any progress. So he's gone g takes h3. I have to decide, is pawn at g2, does it actually carry a threat? Because if I only have a rook, of course, even the threat of rook at h1 check is nothing if the pawn is not protected on g2. So I decided to trade with check, and not too concerned about the back rank because I have pieces to block on the square e8. And as long as that piece is not a rook, then I should be okay. So I can even give a knight, he can sack a rook, and then the knight on g7 does not mate me. He needs another heavy piece, but the only heavy piece he can take, well, immediately would be the rook on b1, but that would give me the check, And I was threatening rook takes c1 check, of course. Alright, so I have the queen in hand now. Pawn at g2 is a mating threat, so he's defended with knight g3. And I think the other choice would have been pawn at b2. That was interesting. Now, a good move here would have been queen a3, because it not only hits the rook and the bishop, he can defend with pawn at b2, but it also gives me a chance to come back along this a3 f8 diagonal and stop rook at f8 check. So queen a3 was interesting. But bishop at f4, that really should have been a knight to hit the bishop on e2, and because remember his knight is tied down to h1, and also threatened knight takes h3. It was quite difficult for him to cover all the threats, but I've missed these strong moves. Knight at f4 or queen a3, bishop on f4. He may win a rook on c1, because trading the knight only helps him defend with h takes g3. So it may win the rook on c1, but even with a rook and queen in hand, it's very hard for me to generate any attack. Maybe I needed to pull the queen back to e6 and defend. This move is just a random move to avoid getting flagged. I have to sack the knight on e7. He's taking a rook and threatening rook takes e. I think the only move to survive is rook at g8. 3, 2, 1. I'm making love for the king, but no, I'm getting mated anyway. And I heard the sound with the move king d7, but I just didn't quite get there in time. I'm sure I'm getting mated somehow, but I was hoping to run out to c6 and b6. Anyway, I was pretty sure I was getting mated and didn't really have any counter-attack anyway. Alright, well played, Art. So it's 1 game all. This is game number 3. And he's reverted to his trusty French. So going to see some heavy theory here, because I did not want to start thinking for 2 minutes on move 7 or move 8. And this is a very forcing line. So leaving the knight on f3 for a moment en prise, taking f6. The intention is simply to play pawn at e7 and win the piece back. And he still has a hole on f6 to be concerned about. So queen takes f3. And the main moves here would be knight at f5 or knight at d5, which have both been played quite a few times. If you look in the openings book, you'll notice that it's mainly Art who's playing the black side of this position. And we are following a game between, again, the finisher and Art. And the finisher played pawn at h5. I decided to play something different. And I did look at this quite a bit before the match. Knight at h4, queen h5. So I don't think yet is the right time to let him capture the queen, because I don't really have a strong enough counterattack. Even after the promotion, the knight on g8 doesn't immediately threaten anything. So rook in hand also, I can't do much with it. So this move, queen b4 check, is very nasty. I don't want to play bishop d2 because he'll most likely sack the queen and just keep checking. Put the bishop on from a distance, cover some squares around the king. So c3, of course it invites knight at c2 check, but it's just a little bit slow. So knight c2 check, king d2, knight takes a1, and then the key move there would be to sack the queen on d5. Queen takes d5 is one of White's main ideas, to threaten knight at f6 and a rook mate on e8. So he can stick the rook back on c2, but then I can just get away with king e3 in that line. That's another advantage of getting rid of the knight and sacking the queen on d5. So, still, it looks like, I'm not sure, he's probably seen this position before, because he played up to about move 20 very quickly. But after c3, pawn at e2, the main threat was knight at c2 or knight at d3, followed by e1 equals queen. That's why I wanted to get rid of the pawn on e2, open up the first rank. So the rook is covering the promotions. Also can bring the queen back, of course, to e2 upon f takes e2 check. So mainly expecting f takes e2, but what else could he try? He could try pawn at c2 check or knight at e3 check. But he's having a long think. Maybe he's just hasn't taken too much of a look at this, because the move pawn at g7, I can't remember what move number it was, like 14 or 15. It has not been played before in the database, so maybe it may have been played in an unrated match or on another server, but as far as I can tell, it's a novelty in an actual game on Lichess. But it is one of the main recommendations of the computer, of course, along with pawn at h5. That's why if you copy a game from the finisher, then you can be pretty much guaranteed that he's studied it. So, deviating on quite a long sequence, I was not expecting my opponent to know too much about the specific moves, maybe some of the ideas, but it's very hard to remember something specifically, especially if it's never been played in an actual game before. So perhaps he's trying to recall what his analysis was, and he's down to his last 15 seconds. Played knight at e3, which is a mistake, because I can just take it. I mean, he's hoping to distract the bishop away from c1, because then there may be some queen takes b2 check at the right time. I mean, I think I can even give up the bishop and the pawn, let him take, and then go king e1 and start running over towards f2, because I'm still not letting the queen get in with check. But I have a simple solution. So the solution is that the bishop on c1 is just going to remain there. I can play f takes e3. One of the knights will take back, and I will simply play king d2. So no more checks after that. And I mean, knight c4 can just be answered by bishop takes c4. If he interposes f takes e2 check, I think I would still bring the queen back to e2. I mean, that helps cover e3 as well. Of course, knight at f6 check is my main idea. So his queen is still hanging on b4, so many threats. No counterattack. He hasn't taken back the bishop on e2. So he's actually a lot of material down, with a mate threat to worry about and a queen hanging. No more checks. So yeah, he's resigned. And we may revisit this game later on in the match. We'll see. If Art can remember some of the other ideas in the position. Alright, so that was game 3. Scoreline is 2-1 in Mugwort's favour. Yeah, you can see me rolling my head and rolling my eyes and thinking, do I want to go into that bishop c5 line again? Surely I can think of something different. But he knows these Scotch lines so well. Knight f6 will be the main move. Knight takes d4 is also playable. Putting the knight back on c6 to hit the queen, or maybe knight f6 first to invite some other options. But I'm assuming he's just going to go for a main line, knight c3. It does invite pawn e5 or pawn at e5. Alright, but queen c4 I'm expecting. So there was a match between Art and Jasugi where they played this, I think, it might have even been the full 5 times, where Art had the white pieces. And the move was not bishop b4, but it was pawn at d4, and then before the knight moves on c3, actually it didn't move at all, but there's an intermediate move, knight at g5, threatening mate on f7. And then Jasugi plays queen e7, he sacks a knight on f7, they swap queens, and bishop c4 check, and so on. But I'm assuming that Art has many improvements, because there were 5 games to review in that line. So I've decided to go for something completely different. The move 8b5 is a gambit, which has only been played once or twice in the database. And queen takes b5, and I don't think castles has been played at all. Rook b8 has been played after b5. And the other move would be, I'm not sure if knight takes e4 is playable. Maybe it is playable instead of castles, but we have a completely new position. And the main idea of this piece sacrifice that it's become is that this move d takes c6 because I've already castled, if he takes it back, he's not giving a check. I have a free move to do whatever I want. And although I'm a piece down and a pawn if he takes it, there's a lot to play for. There's holes on b2 and d2. There's many ways to hit the queen. So even the immediate pawn at b2, bishop takes, pawn at d2, check, king d1. There's moves like rook b8. There's even an extremely daring move, bishop b7, offering the bishop before rook b8, queen takes b7, and then rook b8. So it will be a double pawn sack, a double piece sack, all to gain time hitting the queen. And the counter-attack is fierce after this. So I have not seen this move queen b4. It seems like a good way to decline the secondary gambit on c6. Or it's really the third gambit after sacrificing a pawn and a piece. Alright, so rook e8 was my first thought, just to prevent pawn at e7, or knight at e7 landing on the board. There are many other options here on move 12, so in chess you'd think about knight takes e4 and rook e8. I don't think it's so good because it can be blocked on e5. But other ideas would be pawn at b2, distracting the queen to go backwards, or the bishop to vacate the square d2. I even had this crazy idea to play rook b8 to deflect the queen, and then play pawn at b2 in some order. Or maybe it was pawn at b2 first. The idea is that if the bishop takes b2, then rook b8, then queen takes b8, I've got pawn at d2 and then king d1, bishop g4 check. I can win back the queen. It wasn't entirely convincing. There was something about that I didn't like. Other ideas to play c5 or even pawn at c5. That would be a really funny position with 5 pawns on the c file. Just tempting him to take, and then knight takes e4 hits the queen. There's so many ideas in this position. It's extremely rich. There's a lot to play for both sides. So I decided to go for the most obvious move, I think, in the position, which is rook e8. And we're down to about 1 minute each. And we're barely out of the opening. So expecting him to defend solidly on e4, perhaps bishop at d3, maybe pawn at f3, pawn at d3, bishop to d3 is also possible. And this move surprised me because it's not using the bishop on c1 to threaten anything, because it's very hard to build an attack on the dark squares with pawn at h6 now. There's some vague threat on f7, but I thought it was mainly a defensive move. It's an unusual way to defend with a knight on such a forward square g5. So again, I'm thinking about harassing the queen with c5 or pawn at c5. Pawn at b2 again is possible. It's just hard to decide. Knight at d5 perhaps. Even pawn at d2 check. I had some ideas to sack the queen. Or maybe now sack the queen. Pawn at d2, queen takes d2, bishop at f4 check, and then c takes b4. Because that way, if queen at h8, king takes f7, he doesn't have a knight check. The bishop's very useful in defense. That was a really interesting line. I probably should have gone for that, but decided to be safe and go queen e7. And then if the knight comes back, I'm looking at just blocking up the hole on f7, patching it up with the pawn. Not taking a risk and going for the queen, because I'm still quite a few moves away from a decisive attack myself, and pawn at f7, I've probably got to give up the queen sooner or later. And even if I have rook takes e4 check, it's easily blocked on e3 or e2. Alright, down to 4 seconds. This is going to be a mad time scramble. Assuming, yeah, he's going to trade queens, give the piece back. So it turns out I'm only a pawn down. I have the back rank covered with a queen drop very easily. But this is a good idea to hit the knight on f6, because if he takes it, then he's in already with knight at h6 check. So I really have to watch out if I trade knights. Maybe this isn't the best idea, because it was hard to come up with something in a couple of seconds. But I really have to watch knight at h6 check, opening the diagonal for the queen. So in desperation, 4 seconds, I just wanted to block out. He could probably take it, bishop takes d4. But then maybe something like knight at f5. I wasn't sure what the best way to defend was. Missed a good move there. Yeah, instead of queen at g5, there was something much better. Because the bishop was hanging on c3. He didn't... Yeah, knight at h5 didn't threaten anything. So anyway, there's no time to think. This is a good response. I missed this move, rook at g1. And probably should have gone knight at h4, but again, I'm missing a lot of things here. The rook is now hanging on e4. I don't have a strong enough counter. So I think it's already lost. Yeah, I just lost 2 rooks in a row there and missed. Because I missed him capturing on a. I didn't even really look at that move. And then just allowed rook at g1 in response, defending everything. Alright, so well played out in the time scramble. That's made in 1. Yeah. So still amazed how I let that game slip, because after he didn't play bishop takes d4, it was just a free bishop, d takes c3. With the attack on d2, and it was just crushing because somehow I thought he had 2 knights for h5 and h6, and I got flustered, but yeah, with a couple of seconds left, just take the bishop, remain calm, you know. It was not beyond the realms of possibility that I would notice a free piece and see that he doesn't have enough in hand. Anyway, so we have the same opening again as in game 1. And what did he do? Knight c6 to stop the knight coming into e5. And yeah, it's interesting to note when we repeat a line when both players are taking their time, because I mean, obviously I won game 1. It was fairly comfortable. So he's got to do something different if you repeat the same line. And I'm thinking, could I achieve something more? Was I completely satisfied with knight takes e6 as in game 1? But, I mean, I'm happy enough to stop that knight from moving on c6 by pinning it with bishop at a4. I wasn't very convinced about his counterattack after knight at f4. So I thought he might try something different. He really has to plug up the square e5 to stop the knight's invasion. I was half expecting at some point, maybe if I dropped the pawn, he could castle queenside, but not just at the moment. So d4 is possible. I'm looking into bishop takes c6. Perhaps bishop takes c6 was better because, yeah, the 2 knights coming into e5 are quite scary. I wasn't entirely sure. I didn't look into it too much, but I thought, okay, I want to play d4 anyway. It stops knight at f4. Does allow this bishop b4, but it means that the e-file is a little more exposed. I have pawn at f5 in response. And was looking at how he can defend e6. Didn't really see a good way. I'd be happy if the knight came back to d8. I mean, a new knight on d8. Because it gives me a free hand to take my time, do whatever I want. Probably just castle in that case, but knight at e4 is a better move. And I think here is a key position where I should have just ignored the attack on c3. I mean, his knight's pinned anyway. Both knights are pinned. I should have just castled. And then threatened, maybe not yet knight takes e4, but castle, then pawn at d3, or castle and knight b5 is another idea, even just a3. So often when there's a diagonal piece on the c8, h3 diagonal, I get worried about a pawn at h3, but there's really nothing to be concerned about. He's not going to sack his queen on g2. Yeah, so castling was the move here. Bishop d2, I was thinking of... I guess it was okay, nothing wrong with bishop d2 either. I'm not so happy with the move I played in the game though. Also not happy about taking 2 minutes in the last 3 or 4 moves. The move I decided upon was pawn at d3. So the thing is, he's just going to leave that knight on e4. He's not going to move it, of course. And he's going to take back with the pawn. And the knight on f3 is already mainly covered by the pawn on f6. And I don't really want to go backwards to d2, because then he could start putting pawns on the light squares, h3, d3, and so on. This is a good move, pawn at d7. It unpins the knight, it protects the queen, enabling knight takes c3. So I have to do something about knight takes c3 now. It's either bishop d2 or, again, maybe castles was the best move. And I wanted to hit the queen now that it's sitting up there on e6. I'm not even sure whether I should take this knight on e4. Maybe I should have just left it there and allowed the capture on c3 and tried to hunt down the queen quickly. Alright, 8 seconds. So I did not play very well in the last time scramble in game 4. I really don't want to get down to 2 seconds. At least if I can keep around 10 seconds, I'd be okay, especially if there's a few captures and trades in the next few moves. He's gone back to e7. Yeah, what else? Apart from knight d2, I didn't really see any other move. I mean, he could have captured on f3 and allowed knight takes e6, f takes e2, knight takes c7 check, king d8, and tried to hide with the king on c7, because he was threatening queen at d1 mate in that case. And I was even considering king takes e2 to get rid of the pawn. Maybe bishop d2 is also possible. But he could possibly answer with king takes c7. If there was a knight, if there's a knight there, we played that line with knight takes c7, king d8. And I was trying to calculate that, anticipating e takes f3, but it didn't happen, luckily for me. I didn't see a good continuation. Anyway, so I've got to castle. I'm reasonably happy with my king's safety. I'm a piece up for a pawn. But I'm a long way from generating any counterattack. I'm not sure who's the one attacking at the moment. His pieces are a bit clumsy with the bishop on f8. My pieces are also clumsy with the bishop on c1. So I've got to clear this knight out of the way somehow, the knight on d2. So you have to defend. I decided knight b3 was the best way to defend the knight. I think it's quite decent. Maybe bishop at g3 was also possible. Knight at h3 was possible too. Alright, but my main concern was what to do with this knight on b3. It has to play some role in the game, but decided to cover up. It wasn't the best square for the bishop because knight at g5 now or in the future. But it is hitting d7, so I noticed that I can play knight at c5 and hit the d7 pawn in case he castles. I might as well take it anyway. I could possibly go for the rook and drop the pawn and the rook on. But there's a key move I missed here, knight a5. It was really awkward for him to defend the square c6. Maybe the only way is put a knight on b8, and then I can play rook b1, and it was looking really good, knight a5. So e takes, g takes, bishop takes f4 was a total miss by both players, because he had a knight at h3 check to follow up. But it's just madness here, trying not to get too low on time, because both sides are a long way from a checkmate. This is a mistake to open the h file. Bishop takes h2, very timely counter sack. And I have to run out to f2 to avoid knight takes g4 double check. So the king is going to be safe for the moment on e1 when it comes back out of the check. But he has so many diagonal pieces. I'm really worried about being overrun on e3, d2. We could start with b2. I should have played queen takes e4 check to buy myself a little bit of space and time, make him block with something. But now, this is deadly. Pawn at e3. This knight at e6 doesn't threaten anything. And the key move here missed is bishop takes g3 check, forcing me to block with something that's not a pawn on f2, and then he can just cash in and trade everything. Alright, but this gives me a chance because he's somehow run out of diagonal pieces. I mean, a moment ago he had 4 pawns in hand, and now he's almost run out. So I've got a lot of defense on the second rank, and now going for a counterattack. Half expecting king f8, noticing I can drop a bishop from a distance. He has to block with something. Or king g8, I guess, is possible too. Rook takes f4, comes with check. And he only has knights in hand, which is not really the piece that he wants. So knight at e6. I could even pick up the rook, because then the d7 pawn is useful for promotion. But block with the bishop is very safe. Got everything covered. Again, the knights are not the piece he needs. Even if knight at g3, f1 is well defended. Time to counterattack. Let's go for it. 8 seconds. Enough time to find bishop e6 check. So I need to clear the knight on g7 out of the way. But it was a good spot in queen h4 check. To keep the checks up, get rid of the rook on the first rank. Now I can bring the knight back and trade and put it on again. So there's a lot of mates here, but I decided after king h7, I didn't see knight g5 check, probably led to mate, but might as well pick up another knight. I did actually notice queen at f2 check. I was calculating queen takes, pawn takes, king takes. I still want the rook on d2 to defend d1. That's why I took with the king. And the rook on d2 is also very useful to defend the square f2. So you'll notice the way I'm escaping with the king back to h1. So this move just stops a knight landing with check on g3. And the rook on d2 is a key piece there. Even the rook on h5 was helping to defend. So this move blocks out the queen from g7. And it's a mate. 67 move game. So that was game 5. Now it's the midpoint of the match. And he's decided to take a bathroom break. So take a breather, because that was extremely tense. I may have a smile on my face at the moment, but yeah, I was really feeling the pressure during that game and towards the end. I was reasonably confident that I would survive after he missed bishop takes g3 check and forcing me to block with a knight or a bishop, and yeah, retaining all the pawns for f4 and e3. Yeah, so that was a critical moment in this completely insane 67 move game. It was one for the spectators, because I played pretty much the whole game with about 5 to 10 seconds on the clock, getting down to 2 seconds a couple of times. So yeah, it was a really amazing turnaround. That he had 4 pawns. He was just crushing me with the pawns and the bishops on f4, g3, e3, b2, d2, all the dark squares around the king. And I look back a moment later, he didn't have any pawns left. So don't know what to say about that game. It left John Lee speechless in the commentary. I had a look after the match. And he didn't know what to say about this game, especially when it got past about 50 moves. It must have been very tough to call. And now he knows how I feel trying to call 1-0 between Jasugi and John Lee. Or Opera and John, or Opera and Jasugi. Oh, so almost back to game number 6. I'm not really so thrilled about having a bathroom break when it's a very heavily theoretical match, which it has been so far. So we've had one French game, we've had a couple of Scotch games, or I've played something different on move in game number 4. Game number 4. And game numbers 1 and 5 have not been so theoretical. We've been out of book on about move 8 or so. So we'll see if we have another Scotch in game 6. Just not really falling asleep there on the camera, just trying to decide whether to repeat the same gambit with b5. Yeah, it was exciting. And again, one for the audience. So we're going back to e4, e5, expecting a scotch. And this time, I think I played knight f6. Yeah, that's right. So inviting him to take first on c6, which I think King Switcher did in our previous match. But now going for the same thing. Thought briefly about going back to pawn at d4, but I decided Art is too heavily booked up in that line. So bishop at b4, pawn at d5, b5, queen takes, and castles. All right. We'll see if he wants to repeat with d takes c6. The other main option, I think, would be to stop the threat of knight takes e4. He could also attack with moves like knight at f5 or pawn at h6. So pawn at h6, I was intending just to go knight takes e4 and rook e8. And allow knight at h6 check. Because as long as he doesn't have two knights, I don't think it's all that much of an immediate danger. If he goes d takes c6, it's possible in some cases that there could be a d takes c6 opening the bishop to cover the f5 square, in the case that knight at f5 could be mating me. That's a bit deep, but it's not possible for me at the moment to draw any arrows on the board. I'm sure it would only confuse people anyway. Alright, so 10 bishop d3, we have a new move. And now trying to come up with an idea to use this slight weakness on g2 and f3. Now that e4 is not so much the target. I was also briefly considering rook b8, a6 perhaps. Knight d4, queen c4, I didn't like the look of. Just rook e8 was possible. But I think the best move there is pawn at h3. There's a subtle difference. To explain that might be too much for my meager conceptual to speech ability, because it looks very similar to the move pawn at f3. But there is a subtle difference that black has an extra option of leaving the knight off board and sacking the knight on f6. So let's say knight takes d5. And if he captures that with either piece, the vacant square on f3 is actually very useful, because then I can follow up pawn at g2 and knight at f3 check. And then win the rook after rook g1. So that's the subtle difference between pawn at f3 and pawn at h3, because I can't do anything with a vacant square on h3, but I can with a vacant square on f3. But I did not see this during the match at all. I thought the pawn at f3 was the most aggressive try, so I just went for it. So you can see I've just sacked a knight on d4, and two threats on f3 and the queen. There's also the threat of pawn at g2. So I can include this move before the check, because otherwise he would answer king f1. And because that he hasn't captured with d takes c6, I haven't had time to move the d pawn yet. So therefore, of course, I can't answer bishop h3. It takes too much time. So, okay, fascinating position. He's allowed a promotion on h1. Blocked with the bishop. He has a pretty solid defense, and I don't have a pawn for g2. The piece that I really want right now is a pawn for g2. But I don't want to sack the knight on e4 or d5, because I really have to watch out. He has so many knights and pawns in hand. It would almost be a guaranteed mate after queen takes g7 check. I actually fell for something very similar against Bugzilla after seeing the idea and thinking that I had a defense. But my dark squared bishop was on the wrong square. Anyway, that's another video. That's another story. So I've taken the pawn on f3, he's defended the mate on d1, and for For some reason I was looking at the move c5 to counterattack, but I'm not even sure what the point of that was now, to try and get in the move d takes c6 perhaps. But no, I just come back. I was thinking about queen g4 also to help cover the king, but I thought he would just hit the queen, keep hitting the queen, dropping the knights. So h1 is actually the safest square for the queen. He's only got knight at g3. And I can just put the pawn back on g2. That was the main idea. And if knight takes h1, I mean, probably g takes h1 equals queen is the best, but I was even half considering g takes f1 check, rook at d1, bishop at h3, bishop g2, rook takes e1, and so on. And that just, because that bishop on c8 is normally open, it's just a little bit slow to attack that way. And my other pieces are not doing anything in the attack, so I'm really literally only attacking with a queen and a pawn at the moment. And keeping the rook off board, because there could potentially be either a rook at g1 or even a rook at d1 trick and a promotion. There was another choice, yeah, if knight takes h1, there's also rook at d1 check, followed by the promotion on f1. Alright, so e3. It's a funny idea to put the pawn on e2 and then push it to e3 to open up the bishop again. So I'm actually very happy with this position now. I'm going to pick up another pawn on h2, put it back on g2 is the main idea, but also to cover the square h6 in case he counterattacks with pawn at h6. But also you notice that move e3 closes off the c1 h6 diagonal. So I could even play queen takes h6. I'm not so worried about the counterattack. I just want to get in via g2 and take the bishop, put the rook back on g1 and try to find a mate. Alright, so sacking I think is very useful, not because I'm the one attacking, because there's less pressure on g7. The knight on e7 doesn't really do too much. I mean, some potential smothered mate themes if I... Well, obviously I don't want to take the queen because the pawn at g7, knight at f5. So this is what I was talking about before, deflecting the king. I can promote on f1 so that I have two fake queens. He has two real queens, but I have the first check. So rook at e1, 15 seconds to find a mate. It's not that obvious. The queen on f6 covers both c3 and f3. Now this was deliberate. I did see this. Queen takes f3. Could have been answered by knight at c3, king d2, queen takes e1 check, king takes e1. And then the amazing deflection, queen h1 check, and then rook at d1 to mate, or he could run away with king d2, but there was a free queen on f3. It also covers any possible mates on f7 if he sacks his knights. So putting the bishop on here, in going back to the game, his queen is still defending c3 and f3. The main point was just to pick up another blocker on f3. I could deflect the queen either way. They both lead to mate, but this way I saw I could keep putting the bishop from a distance, either take the blocker or even better to play queen h3, because threatening queen takes g4. If he runs back it doesn't help. So I think bishop takes g4 is better because I can trade the queen anytime I want, deflect the king away. If king takes f6 mates, I missed a mate in one with d6 or f6, but it doesn't matter. Doing everything with check, so that was the main idea after the promotion with rook at d1 and g takes f1 equals queen. So pretty happy with that finishing sequence. I managed to do it all with checks and didn't give him a look in with stuff like queen at g8 and knight at g6 and so on. Alright, scoreline is 4-2 Mugwort. This is game number 7 and we have a repeat of game number 3. So, half expecting him to switch with knight at f5, but no, we're going to go for the same very long, heavy theory. Rook g6 is another option here, but of course then I can keep the bishop off the board. Going back to pawn at g7. It was funny, after knight at h4, queen h5, pawn at f3. After the game, somebody ran the computer analysis, and the computer found this move as an inaccuracy because it preferred g8 equals rook. I found that quite amusing because of course if your opponent takes it, it doesn't matter, it's only a pawn when it's captured. But yeah, quite amazing, the computer, and amusing, the computer doesn't recognize this. So again, I'm moving queen takes e2 because I think it's the main move, but alright, we have something new. And I should be careful. This pawn is poisoned. It is a trap. I should play king d2. I mean, there are only 2 legal moves in the position. Would he really play pawn at c2 if I can just take it for free? No, I should play king d2, and then if he drops a knight, then I can take the pawn. I mean, I knew the idea of knight at a3 check and queen takes c3, so I have to respond with king d1 or king d2. But if king d2, the other thing is if f takes e2, I can actually grab the free queen. C takes b4. In the game, I wasn't entirely sure whether I could do this, but yeah, it's around about here I realize I'm actually in a bit of trouble because I don't really have anything better than just queen takes e2. So knight f6 doesn't work, queen takes f7 doesn't work, there's no useful rook checks. If I take the queen, he's got way too much. Probably e1 equals knight check should be enough to mate. I mean, he'd have 4 knights, a bishop, a pawn, and his king can never find a permanent way to hide away. For example, king d2, knight at f3 check, king e2, bishop at d3 mate. That's those sort of ideas. Oh, it's not mate, king d1, pawn at c2 mate. That's what I mean. Yeah, so I can't afford to take the queen, which means the only other move is queen takes c2. I mean, I was hoping to make queen takes d5 work. But again, I think e1 equals queen is very dangerous. Even bishop at d1 looks dangerous as well. So, queen takes e2 played after a long think. Expecting knight at a3 check and just deciding whether to go king d1 or king d2. Now, of course, b takes a3 is fatal because he'd eventually put a pawn on c2, make me trade queens and put it back. So king d1 I think was preferable. Try and make him put a pawn on c2 and maybe I'll end up taking it later. But yeah, this bishop on g5 is such an effective piece. Defending against any possible knight at f6 check if I can pick up a knight. And also you're going to see the value of the bishop a little bit later in this game. Okay, so Art is a minute up on the clock. And we're going to see this devastating attack about to begin. Just finding the right move order is tricky. So I'm sure he's looking at knight c4 check, or perhaps a pawn move to hit the queen, pawn at d3, pawn at f3. I guess he's looking at a knight sack on e3, knight g takes e3 for example. Don't forget his queen is still hanging. Queen on b4. Yeah, so the value of that bishop on g5 makes itself felt when you consider a line like knight c4 check, queen takes c4, queen takes c4, and I don't have knight at f6 check mating, because he takes with the bishop first, knight takes, and I lose the checking sequence. So that's why I'm not sacking the queen, I'm playing king d1 instead. Queen b5, alright, I get a move. Now there's a deadly threat of knight c takes something, check, and then queen takes e2 check. I'm sure he has enough pieces to mate. At least do some serious damage. So I think pawn at d3 as played in the game is essential. Just Just having a last little look whether there's anything else. I don't think the immediate knight sack on b2 or e3 works, even though he's got 3 knights piled up on e3. The pawn at f3. A pawn at d2 is perhaps an interesting option. But yeah, the choice is either take it or play queen c2. I was just about to play the correct move and take it, but then I got scared of a queen landing on d3, a black queen landing on d3 and being mated on c2. But it turns out that wherever he sacks the knight on c4, I can take it with the bishop, and that way block with a pawn on d2, run the king to c1 if there's a pawn at c2 check, and I was totally safe. So I saw, what I saw wasn't clear enough to be convinced that it was safe. But yeah, queen takes f3 was the move. This is actually a fatal mistake, playing queen c2. And I'm sure he sees the move instantly, but he's just going to double check it and triple check everything. So queen takes f3, knight c takes e3 check, bishop takes e3, queen takes d3, pawn at d2, knight g takes e3, f takes e3, knight takes e3, and finally queen takes e3, because I have enough knights on f6 to mate. Alright, so the double knight sack, the other knight comes in with a fork, and the most important part of this whole sequence, it's a discovered check from the bishop on g5, where I told you that bishop was an important piece. So I have to play king c2 to survive. Then just about any check wins. A sack on b2, a sack on d3, queen at e2 check I think is the cleanest way to finish, and bishop at a4 cuts off the king. Then he can bring the bishop back out of the way or just finish off with the pawns on d3 and c2. And if he saw bishop at a4, he'd play it instantly, but no, he's looking at the clock instead maybe. 4, 3, 2, 1, bishop at f5. He's let me escape. I still should be a mate because he has a key move pawn at b4 check. But he's missed it. He's played a non-checking move and let me get away with it. Oh, wow. What a game. Alright. I really got out of jail there. I was not expecting to survive. That was a shock. That was a real shock to everybody who was playing, commentating, observing, both during and after the game, I'm sure. But yeah, he missed many mates. And there with cutting off the king, or and pawn at b4 at the end. Turns out the king was not safe on a3 after all. Alright, so we've seen this already, no need to comment too much. But I'm trying to find a better idea than pawn at f3. It wasn't entirely convincing. I mean, even though you might revisit the game number, game number 6, and think, oh yeah, you had all those fake queens and you're promoting all over the place. You had a queen factory on g2 and g1 and f1. But the opening part after pawn at f3, I wasn't so convinced because I'm giving up a lot of material, and there are ways for him to preserve. I mean, give up the queen, cover the king a little bit more by putting something back on g2. And yeah, I nearly actually played a6, and I'm still not even sure why. a6, queen c4, knight e5. Was that my idea? But I realize it just doesn't really work that well. Playing knight takes f3 check if the king's on f1, and again going back to that point of not opening up the bishop on c8 by moving the d-pawn. So I think this is why he's not capturing on c6, because of that deadly light square bishop near the king, or pointing in the direction of the king at least. Yeah, I'm sure he could also go to d1 potentially. So going for the same sequence, but expecting him to deviate very soon and not let it get too deep into the revisitation of game number 6. So there are many ways to sack the queen, and it's good when you're playing a new opening to give your opponent many choices, because there's so much to weigh up if you don't know the position. I mean, this is new to me as well, but at least I have a clear idea of what I'm playing for, the weaknesses on g2 and f3. I'm not even so much interested in taking the queen if I have pawn at g2 on offer. So perhaps his best move is simply pawn at g2 here, or bishop at f1, or maybe taking on c6, and then, because taking this way gives me a hole on c3. If he allows me to take the queen by patching up g2, then I have queen at c3 in the end. And even then, he's got similar ideas to game number 1 with bishop at pawn at d2 and bishop at b2. And maybe I have to give the queen back on c1 just to avoid being attacked. I'm really not sure. It would be a big mess. It would be fun to play. Alright, so he has gone pawn at g2 and has allowed queen at c3. Now, what other options would there be here? Now, of course, I want to open the bishop on c8 to take on f5, but if I play d6, it does allow something to land on e7. Maybe a knight is even more deadly than a pawn, because he's got the follow-up of pawn at h6. So bishop at d2, and assuming his idea is pawn at e7. Now, it's important here that he doesn't have any more diagonal pieces, because one option is to sack the queen on e7, king h8, and he doesn't have pawn at h6. Bishop h6 doesn't work with the other bishop pinned. But again, it's one of those positions where I have to calculate absolutely precisely. Queen e8 is a safer option, so letting him take the rook, queen takes back. He's only got a knight and a rook in hand, which is not immediately all that deadly. But I decided to play what Katask would call a chicken fork. So sack the queen on c1, bishop at b4 check, and of course I can pick up the pawn with the bishop anytime I want. But he has an issue here, how to defend the check. Does he block? Does he play king e2 or king d1? Obviously king f1 falls into mate with rook at e1. Other option, knight at d2, blocks his own bishop, and I just respond, bishop takes e7. But there's this very interesting option of playing c3, which happens in the game, and I guess you could say that he's playing chicken with me. Do I want to take the pawn head on and go for the attack and just leave that pawn dangling there on e7? Or do I want to play safe and pull back the bishop to e7? Both sides, both options, very decent, very much worthy of consideration. So safe move again, queen e8, allowing the capture on f8. Queen takes f8, but it's not really my style to play safe. Let's go for it. Pawn at b2. Probably not the best move objectively, because his king after castling is so safe. So he can even just ignore that fake queen, let me take on f1, bishop takes f1, and it takes a lot of moves to get in. In the meantime, what's happening around my king? Maybe I should not even give him a pawn for e7 or h6 and just have taken the fake queen back straight away. Such a complicated position, but so much fun. I do hope it's fun for the audience as well. So rook takes d8. How does white attack? Is it queen at h6? Is it queen at e7? Pawn at e7. Queen at h6, I really wasn't sure what the response was going to be. Bishop at f8 runs into pawn at e7. Rook at g6 runs into knight e7. Maybe some weird looking knight move to defend and open the bishop on c3. Even throw the knight away. I don't know whether knight takes d5 or knight takes e4 was possible. Knight h5 even, I don't know. It's Crazy position. So he's gone pawn at e7, bishop a6, just to clear the back rank, try and make him confused about the bishop hanging on a6, or make him waste a tempo by taking it. I'm not sure about this queen at g3 move, because rook at g6 is a good defense. I don't mind this at all, because he doesn't have a knight for f7. I could even play h takes if I want to. Now surely he's got to take the bishop on a6, or play a threatening move like queen at e7. And even queen at e7, I can just ignore it and take on b5, because queen takes rook check, bishop at g8 is a good defense. And then obviously threatening rook takes f1, so this is a big mistake, allowing me to just win a lot of material. He's still got no threats after bishop at g8, and yeah, the threat of knight at e2 check is too strong. So unlucky for Art, because bishop takes a6 certainly would have kept him in the game. Really wasn't sure what the response would have been. Perhaps put a rook somewhere on the back rank. There was no easy way to block out that diagonal a6 back to f1. Alright, so I've had a few time scrambles in this game, especially games number 4, 5, that last one, game number 8. I might have even forgotten one or two. Oh, that one where he missed a mate, of course, with pawn at b4 at the end. Alright, but we've gone for the Jasugi line. So we've had this opening a couple of times, Schwanet versus Jasugi versus Art, but also Schwanet versus Art. So I think Art is the only person who's played the black side of this opening. And it was more my secondary weapon in case the other line failed somehow. The other line with knight takes f6 check on move 5. Yeah, so all this is very well known from the previous games in the candidates, mainly Jasugi versus Art, which was one of the first matchups. So there's this very well known game to me, which is one of the two games Art defeated Jasugi. We're coming up to the critical moment, which is move 17. But pawn at g5, simply want to get rid of the knight and then go rook at e8 check after you take the knight with g takes f6. There's an ingenious move, knight at c4. You could also play knight at g4 or knight at g6 with the same idea, to play bishop b4 check. Now Jasugi, I think, immediately responded with c3, which of course is the natural move. But there's an incredible counter with knight takes e5, rook at e8 check, and king d7. So white must play the move bishop d2 to not just stay in the game, but it is actually, I believe, a winning move, bishop d2. So I did know this position, in case you were wondering. It was prep. So yeah, critical moment there. Jasugi got mated after c3, knight takes e5, rook at e8 check, king d7. And there's no good way for white to stop the oncoming attack with knight at f3 check. c3 also opens up the square d3 in case you want to sack the queen and go king d1. That fails to queen at d3, and there'll be mate next move on c2 or d2. So now I've got rid of this all-important piece, which is the black bishop on b4, defending any possible knight at c5 mates. I'm threatening mate in 2 with bishop e7 and knight at c5. I'm prepared to sack the queen and go king d1, because that bishop on b4, it's now turned into a white bishop. It's not only attacking on e7, but also defending all the mates on e1, after pawn at e2 and queen at f1 and so on. So there was a moment where I could have played rook at e8 check. And an obvious question, if you don't know this position, is why not play rook at e8 check first? Well, because he can actually take it and survive, because the knight at that moment is on e5 defending a key square f7. But you can even play king d7, and after queen at f1 check, it's incredible. You can work it out here that knight at e1 is actually a mistake. It's a losing move after queen at f1 check in this position, but also after rook at e8 check, king d7 before. And you can work out the move on the video. I'll tell you in a minute. But yeah, pawn at e2, king c1. The attack just fails. Queen at d1 check, rook takes, pawn takes, king takes, g1 equals queen. Knight at e1, not rook at e1, knight at e1. And he'll run out of checks very soon after that. So rook takes e1, bishop takes e1, knight at e3, f takes, knight at f2, bishop takes, rook at d2, king c1, and he has to sack a rook to continue the attack. So yeah, it's going to be mate in a few after he sacks all these pieces. Yeah, so going back to that key moment, why not drop the rook on e8? Why do you need it as a blocker on e1? Because of the incredible triple question mark move, queen to e2. So queen to e2, just throwing away a full queen, would actually be winning for black, because then the king is forced to take. He's got knight takes g1 check to follow up, and the knight is a useless defender in that case on e1. So incredible that the rook is needed to block the queen at f1 check on e1. Alright, so scoreline is 7-1. I don't think anybody will be repeating that opening again. Well, not from move 17. There are obviously an endless ways to vary before move 17. Alright, but perhaps a bit of luck. Maybe he didn't know that bishop d2 was winning. Maybe it was a bluff. I think there were people in the chat I noticed after the match thinking that I was bluffing by playing fast, but no, not bluffing. I have no natural talent, just the ability to look at the previous matches. It's quite useful to look at your opponent's previous candidates' matches. It's helped me a couple of times in this series. Alright, so we have a completely new opening, although it looks like game numbers 1 and 5. It's actually very different with the knights out on f3 and c6 already, because of the knight on c6, he doesn't have any good squares with the knight on f3. So I'm quite happy to give up a bishop early for a pawn, because it looks like I'm going to win a piece back very soon. There's also knight d4 coming, if the knight runs anywhere. So I simply want to develop the bishop to, let's say, d6, to castle kingside, and try to take complete control of the center of the board. Alright, so bishop at a4. We have a new position in terms of the database, I think already on about move number 7. But certainly this is new to me. Bishop at a4. I mean, I might as well win as many tempi as I can, taking the knight, dropping it back, hitting the queen. So covering the square c6 and e6 and hitting c2 is most natural with knight at d4. So knight at d4 was played in the game, but not the best move. Knight at d4 is not the best move. And the trick I missed in the game, I think both players missed something very simple, and you can challenge yourself if you don't know this position. See if you can find the best play for black here. Yeah, it's really only a 2-move tactic. The best move was knight at h4, because to defend, to keep a hold of g2, the only move is queen g3. But then a simple deflection of the queen with pawn at f4. And there's no good way to respond. You just have to abandon the pawn on g2 or throw away the queen somehow. And hope for a counterattack via pawn at a6 or knight at e5. Yeah, so knight at d4, of course, it's still a perfectly decent move. Nothing wrong with it. If he hit the knight with queen e3 or queen d3, I'd probably just pull it back to f5. A knight f5 certainly looks good here to hit the queen, because he's trying to make it hard for my bishop to develop on f8. Even briefly considered bishop d6, queen g7, bishop e5. Assuming he's going to sack the queen, bishop takes h8, rook at g8 check, queen at f8. Rook takes, king takes. He has a queen in hand, but I thought there's not a lot that he can do with it. But yeah, this is a lot safer. Knight f5. Keep my king side nice and secure. And the main concern here is pawn at a6 to worry about, and also moves like knight at a5. So defending passively, try to avoid. Moves like pawn at d7 are no good. He'd probably just go knight takes d5 in response. Moves like a6 still fall prey to knight at a5. Now this is a big mistake. Pawn at e4 is a terrible move. I should have just gone on with my plan, ignored all the threats, and played bishop d6 and castle kingside. And forget about the pawn on b7 or the knight on c6, because the counterattack is very strong with so many pieces developed and so much central control. And I can afford to give up a pawn or a piece on b7 or c6. It doesn't really matter. Moves like knight h4 coming and queen g5 also. Yeah, I mean, I can't play queen g5 here because he gets the first attack with queen takes b7 and so many checks. All the pieces are falling with check. I just don't quite get time. Still, the best move in this position is bishop d6 and castle, and giving up all the pieces and then knight h4, or even knight h4 immediately. But yeah, rook b8 getting down to 3 seconds. I don't know why I do this to myself. Maybe bishop d6 was a bit safer. Yeah, this is a bit of a useless move because he's just going to go knight takes d5. I mean, I can castle and get some relative safety, but yeah, bishop d6 was such a better move. I had some vague idea to push e4, e3, but didn't really see it working too well. Rook at e4 check or rook at e5 check. Alright, so he's got 50 seconds up on the clock. Here we go again, another mad time scramble. This is the final game. Bishop takes d5 also possible to try and clean up all the pawns. Knight d4. I mean, obviously, there's a mate threat on e2 and c2. There's a check. I'm assuming he's going to castle. If only I had another pawn for f3 or h3. Then I'm in, but I got nothing, so I might as well just castle in response and leave another piece hanging on b4 and hope something will work with queen g5 or bishop h3. I'm so much material down, I just have to throw everything into the attack. Pawn at f6, good response. Knight at h6 was apparently a mate in 12 that I noticed after the game. A little bit hard to calculate everything though. Alright, so expecting either a check. I've got good control over the square f5. It's essential to control f5 here to stop the knights landing on h6 and f5. So I didn't have to deal with the rook at h8 threat or the gf8 threat. The best move was queen at g5, counter-attacking. Yeah, the king, it's safe for the moment that there's no bishop for g7, but yeah, I mean, all he has to do is notice that he can take a bishop on b4 anytime. He could even just pick off the pawn on h3. I've got nothing left. Knight at f3 check is not a mate. I need more material, but yeah, fatal mistake is coming up here. Knight takes f5 allows knight e2 check, hg2 and queen at f3 mate. So he's got the same problem as me. I think in the time scrambles he always looks for something direct and forcing, but the key to that position was just to stay patient and absorb the material, take the pawn on h3, give me nothing back, and even get rid of the pawn on e4, and then look for a mate later. There was no need to rush at all. So yeah, I was quite lucky to win several of those games. This game and also the game where he missed several mates in the long French. I'll have to call it the art variation with knight at d5. But there was some, as well as say 4 of the games being heavy preparation, there were a lot of random moments in that match, especially the 67 move game. The time scrambles were all very exciting to play, and hopefully very exciting as well for the crowd. So hope you enjoyed the match. Scoreline 8-2 to Mugwort. And this is actually round 8 because of an overdue match versus King Switcher, who will hopefully come back to the matches very soon. So stay tuned for more. Thanks everybody for watching, and see you in the next match.